Today on UVA Legends podcast, I have sports lawyer Mark Levinstein, a Williams and Connolly attorney. Actually, 40, I think at least 41 years of Williams and Connolly, one of the best litigation firms and also sports law firms in the country. Mark is a 79 graduate of UVA, played soccer there, 82 graduate of a little obscure place called Harvard Law School, um, after which he joined Williams and Connolly soon after. Mark does other things. He's been the outside general counsel for the U.S. National Soccer Team Players Association, as well as taught at Georgetown Law, George Mason Law, UVA Law, of course, where he's an adjunct professor now, teaching antitrust and sports law. Mark, did I get most of that correct?
You're all good.
Oh, good. All right. That's your Williams and Connolly, the website. They do a great job, whoever's handling that for you. Well, look, I want before we get back to your background, I did want to start with what's going on in sports today. You spent your whole career watching the evolution of sports, free agency, Kurt Flood. That was a little before your time, but the lottery picks in the NBA, all the things that's happened to develop pro sports and how they work. Now in college sports, we have all these things going on at once. The conferences are exploding. The ACC doesn't mean anything anymore like it did when we were there. The NIL, name, image, and likeness, it's gone from being just a sponsorship thing to actually evolving into pay to play. The transfer portal, when you were at UVA, when I was there, it was a big deal when you transferred. You sat out a year. Now there are players on rosters that have been at 4 or 5 colleges, including the junior college, and that's after they've reclassed in high school. When you and I know you've done some work with colleges, and your work at Williams and Connolly, the firm does work with different issues with colleges. Do you think there needs to be some reform, some teeth put into, or are these things going to evolve, or as the government bodies need to step in and give some direction?
Well, what has to happen is unclear because we can continue as is.
Mhm.
The problem is not new to sports. Sports have gone from amateur to pro. Basically, every sport has done this. The Olympic world used to be amateur. Jim Thorpe lost all his medals because he played a little semi-pro baseball. Things like this have happened historically. Tennis was amateur in large part until 1968. Amateurism has always been a situation where the employer or the people running the sport have gotten free labor. So that's not new. The problem is you're imposing it on a very complex regulatory scheme that affects many sports. It's not just college football is now going pro. It's that the whole college sports ecosystem is being changed, and assumptions and strategies that have been made and the whole way the business developed was based on certain understanding of how much they would have to pay to get players. And so when you all of a sudden say, okay, now you have to pay your football players, but you have a regulatory scheme that includes you have to pay perhaps women players equal to men players under Title IX. The school has been set up on subsidizing the other sports using the profits from football that may go away if you have to pay all those profits out to players. Just lots of things change. And the only group that's capable of changing the whole system, changing the rules around it, is the US federal government through congressional legislation. And right now they don't have a particular interest in doing that, from what I can tell. And until that happens, there'll be a lot of chaos and there will be a lot of abuse because there is not a regulatory body in place to worry about issues like what are the agreements between players and their agents look like, things that players associations have done in pro sports. So right now there's a lot of turmoil and it's not clear how that can be resolved.
Yeah. Will the NCAA survive? It's the NCAA is amazing for putting on a great basketball tournament in March. That's March Madness is an incredible thing, but it remains so. But it seems like it's under fire from every other direction.
Yes, I mean it's the body that's imposed the rules. So And what happens is states are now come along and passed a law that says this rule of the NCAA can't be enforced. And they've picked one rule here or one rule there. For example, the prohibition on schools paying players, that's not okay, the state says. And then the whole system is built around that. It becomes very difficult. It's hard to be the regulator. In addition, what people don't realize is the NCAA is regulating, I don't know, 2,000 schools in 30, 40 different sports. So the rules don't just apply to football, they apply to women's tennis, they apply to all these different sports. And trying to set up rules that require investigations or policing of the rules, it's virtually impossible for the NCAA to start policing whether rules have been followed by, 500 athletes a school times 1,000 schools.
Yeah. Well, it's going to continue to be interesting. Do you find yourself, and I'm sure, Williams and Connolly could probably price themselves out of some things, but do you foresee yourself getting involved representing college players or getting involved in a higher level? I know Williams and Connolly does work with at the college level, but also with high school athletes. Some of these guys are going to be worth a lot of money really early. They don't have to even wait to college to start making a lot of money. So do you see lots of sports lawyers getting involved at a very young age?
Well, different kinds of sports lawyers. We don't generally represent athletes as their agent. We used to do that. We haven't done that in recent years. Sometimes when I'll represent a high-profile athlete at whatever level in a dispute, he'll then ask me to do some work for him after that. But we're not in the business of going out and representing high school athletes to negotiate their deals with colleges, things like that. And it used to be that the people doing that were all certified by the players' associations. Now, with high school and college athletes, there is no rule about what your brother, your cousin, the guy down the street can all represent you. There's no one who certifies who's qualified to be an agent or not an agent. So there's a lot of people out there trying to become sports agents for people at all different levels.
Yeah. Well, lots of practice areas, like, for example, I practiced in Northern Virginia, and there's a lot of great construction boutiques in Northern Virginia, probably probably proportionally more than most places in the country. A lot of construction practices, aren't conducive to big law. They don't necessarily work as well. I know Crowell & Moring has some construction practice and others do, but a lot of times they've worked better in boutiques. Do you find in the practice of sports law and all the things that you've done, and I know you're not representing athletes and stuff, but do you find that it is conducive to big firm practice?
Well, sports agent practice has generally been on a percentage of fee basis.
Right.
And as regulated by the players' associations, there are limits on what fees you can take from the contract of a pro football player when he signs with a team. We generally practice on an hourly basis. We charge people. And that's difficult because one of my former partners would represent 10 basketball players. In order to do a good job, he'd have to go to the All-Star game. Who's he working for at the All-Star game? Who should pay for his time going to the All-Star game when he has 10 different clients? 1/10 each, or the guy who's a free agent now pays more. I mean, all those sorts of issues. It doesn't really match. And the way that these people have made money is taking high fees, for example, on their endorsement deals. So if a player does a deal with, Nike or a beverage company or whatever, they're not regulated by the PA with respect to those amounts, and they often charge higher fees and make their money on that side of the business. It's not really the kind of thing we do. And in general, being a sports agent is only to a limited extent the practice of law. I mean, lots of sports agents aren't lawyers, and you don't have to be a sports agent. And so it isn't particularly suited for the large firm practice.
Yeah. Well, one thing you've done a lot of is work with the national soccer team, and soccer is hot in this country. Obviously, we're watching. Everyone has a Premier League team now, and a lot of folks are watching MLS and they're attending games. And on the women's side, the NWSL is gaining popularity. Well, it's an exciting time. You're also an antitrust lawyer, and Americans for all, we talk a lot about capitalism. we structure our leagues differently than the rest of the world. Whereas in Europe and throughout other parts of the world, a local club team could actually play its way into the very top league in a country. And then if they win that league, they can be involved in a Champions League type competition. Whereas in America, big money interests buy a franchise, they're part of a league and they have voting rights. It's a completely different model. We talked a little bit about this offline. Do you think there's anything about the way the rest of the world regulates their sports that at some point MLS or some of the American leagues can be organized in the same way?
Well, so let's look at MLS. I mean, the way MLS got off the ground was all based on the promise to the people who invested. People who invested said, you want me to put up money in a startup MLS league in 1996 that we all know is going to lose money for a while, maybe for a lot of years. Maybe it'll never succeed. They'd already seen 15 years earlier than 1984, the original North American Soccer League went out of business after a bunch of years. So there was no certainty. They were not going to buy into a model that said at the end of the day, by the way, if you don't play well, you may be a minor league team that you'll own. And in return for that promise that they'd stay at the top, those owners invested and worked with their communities and built soccer-specific stadiums. And the view was soccer couldn't survive in this country without a whole creation of an infrastructure of 20, 30, 40, 20,000 to 30,000 seat stadiums that cost a lot of money, that the NFL stadiums were too large, fans wouldn't have the right experience sitting in a 80,000 seat stadium with 15,000 people there. It wouldn't feel right. And so having done all that, they weren't going to agree to a proposition where after they built that, if their team didn't win, they would be in a minor league getting less television revenue and so on. So the whole fundamental structure was built on that premise. And the result, they also agreed to all sorts of restrictions on competition in terms of how much you could pay for players and what players you could sign. And as a result, we have a league that's not a top 10 league in terms of quality of play, but it's absolutely a top 10 league in terms of quality of the stadium experience and quality of the stadiums and where you're sitting and all that sort of thing. So whether the quality of the play will follow or not, it was built in a certain way, and the only way it can change is for the owners of that private league to agree. And there's no way those guys are going to get around the table and vote and say, yes, the guy down the road who didn't invest any money, who didn't pay 100 million or 200 million, or now probably MLS teams are probably worth $500 million, that he can somehow have the asset worth $500 million when he built a club team and signed a few good players. That's not likely to happen in our time.
Right. So it makes sense why that's the case in football, because the NFL has been around since 1933, and I think pro football has been around 1920, and the NBA has been around since 1950. So I understand that with regards to those sports, but the MLS is probably only 25, 30 years old. So when they started the MLS and they built these great stadiums, they had the chance to evolve the sport like other countries have. Well, didn't the other countries have the same issues in the way, in building the stadiums and getting things done? Is there something different about how Americans view athletics that we had to do it this way? Or, what explains the fact that it is so different?
It's because the sport was big enough in those countries that those teams existed before there was money. Those teams existed as local teams for many, many years. And over time, the money caused those people to invest in order to build the stadiums, but also knowing all along, everybody who invested understood exactly the financial terms. He understood that if they built that great stadium at Man United and they then lost a bunch of games, they could be in the championship and not in the Premier League anymore. And they took that gamble, and they were willing to do that. But there was a soccer team in every city. There were hundreds of soccer teams that existed. Here, the only way we could get the sport on the map was to get those people at the top level to invest and build those stadiums. And then the grassroots have been building up underneath that. I mean, the USL came about in part because the MLS showed that there was enough interest in a top pro league they built a minor league underneath it. So it's just a whole different model. And yeah, our country is differently situated. Minor league teams in all sports have struggled in this country. I mean, it's only minor leagues that have been supported by the major leagues that have done well over time. And it's because our fans, I think, can watch everything on television. So unless it's viewed as a better entertainment product, it's going to be hard to get people to go to those stadiums.
No, it's interesting how it's different. Well, women's sports, female sports have always been a source of a lot of work for people in your practice. Virginia Slims, in the '70s with tennis. The Billie Jean King movie, the Title IX you mentioned earlier. There's always gender equality issues with sports. With Caitlin Clark in basketball in the last few years, the WNBA is really exploded. I mentioned women's soccer earlier, and it is exciting. When you see this growth of women's sports, does that bring on more issues for your practice or the practice generally, or are those issues always there? Even no matter what the level is of the women's, the interest in women's sports, there's always going to be issues.
So the question historically in this country has been, does it matter that a women's team against a men's team, the men's team would win in terms of whether you want to watch the women's team? That's always been the question. And historically, the answer has been, because the men's team would beat the women's team isn't worth watching. That's been the viewpoint. That's what's changing. It doesn't really matter if they're the best women in the world or they're the best women in the country or they're the best women in your state. They're worth watching. And people are changing their views on whether it's enjoyable to watch that entertainment product. It's just we have to remember sports is an entertainment product and the dollars come from two primary sources. How many people want to watch it on television and how many people want to watch it in stadium? Those are where the revenue primarily comes from, because once you have those two things, the sponsorship comes with it. The more eyeballs are watching your game, whether they're in person or they're on television, the sponsors want to reach those fans that you have glued to watching your game in between. In the breaks, they want to watch those commercials. So that's what drives things. And historically, there was a view among sponsors and everyone else that the women's game wasn't as interesting because they weren't as good. And when that changes, it creates an entire new set of entertainment products. And they're just like any other entertainment product. And the more people watch it, means, some people say pickleball is not a sport. It's not like tennis. But if people want to watch it, it's going to become a big sport. Yeah. That's the simple answer.
What explains why it happened now, though? Like in 1971 with Billie Jean King, and then by the mid '70s with Chris Evert, and then later Martina Navratilova, Martina Hingis. There were these great personalities, and even though we might not want to watch an early round game in the U.S. Open, the television ratings on the women's finals would rival the men. What happens? Do you think is it just maybe a couple personalities like Caitlin Clark can make all the difference, or do you think it's something in society that we change?
Well, one thing about our country is we want to watch the person. There's a person we think is great, and we'll turn on and watch them play. Even in a team sport where there's soccer, there's 10 other people on the field. And it's a strange phenomenon. I mean, watching Lionel Messi play with MLS team all of a sudden makes the team a massive demand. When in Europe, they'd say, what's Lionel Messi doing on a team with 10 other guys who aren't at his level? Although there's a couple other on Inter Miami that might be viewed in the same ballpark. But Caitlin Clark changed perspective. And the colleges have worked hard with volleyball and things like that. In certain pockets in the country, there's been an interest. They watched Nebraska volleyball play a game in a football stadium and sell it out occasionally. I mean, things like that. And whenever there's an opportunity to do that, there's always entrepreneurs willing to try and take that product and put it other places, especially because they think they can buy the product cheap and then generate the interest. And all of a sudden that product's worth hundreds of millions of dollars a team.
Yeah. Well, Mark, one thing that's been quiet over the last 5 years, probably since the Russian Olympics, is we haven't heard a lot about doping. And doping was a really big deal during the Lance Armstrong years, but also in back in the East Germans in the track and field, and the Russians, more recently. But things have been quiet lately. Um, I think that Williams and Connolly has been involved in some of those matters. Um, are we turning the corner on doping? Because I haven't heard much about this recently. Whereas, it used to be something that was talked about with sports quite often.
Well, how much doping is going on is unclear. Part of what's happening is you aren't watching many Olympic sports. So track and field has faded from our consciousness in large part. So even if an athlete in track and field tests positive, you don't hear about it as much, especially in sports where U.S. athletes aren't doing as well. There's also much more testing of a much more sophisticated level. So it is more difficult to get past those protocols. And as the sport gets cleaner, there's less pressure to dope in order to remain competitive. But for example, the Tour de France has faded out of consciousness in large part since Lance Armstrong stopped competing in it. So how much doping is going on in Tour de France, you probably don't have a clue. Like how many have tested positive or not tested positive, just because it really doesn't matter in the United States right now. But also there are a bunch of other sports where there's less testing. And the US government was in part responsible for insisting that more drugs were on the banned list. For example, things like marijuana, and those are starting to come off the list. So a lot of the positive results were in not even necessarily performance enhancing drugs that were on there for other societal and legal reasons. But for example, we have the recent scandal with Chinese swimmers and whether they were doping, not very in the consciousness of the United States sports market, but people don't realize that the 2034 Olympics that was awarded to Salt Lake recently, people don't even know that the 34 Olympics are coming to Salt Lake again, but the IOC conditioned that grant on the US making a current criminal investigation involving the Chinese swimmer issues go away. So there's a lot in the political world, and what's fueled the interest is when very high profile athletes who are important in the US have had drug testing issues like Marion Jones, Lance Armstrong. That's why we think that there was a lot going on in doping. And when we don't have that many high profile athletes in those sports involved in doping issues, it doesn't seem like a big issue here.
But it is interesting is we don't hear about it in baseball. We don't hear about it in football anymore or basketball. I mean, it used to at least be, in the news quite often. Do you think you mentioned testing's gotten better? Do you think maybe and there's less pressure to look like Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa these days?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't testing in baseball that would stop that. There is now. So those kinds of things. But remember, all that's done under the collective bargaining agreement. There's a lot more people get suspended. They don't tell why. There's a lot more of in the pro leagues as opposed to the Olympic world. The Olympic world, you test positive, they want to tell the whole world you tested positive and got suspended because they're trying to convince you that they're doing something about doping. So any positive result has always been a source of publicity. With a union and a league negotiating it, they view it as a problem. The athletes tested positive. They're not here to ruin the athlete. They're here to get them off the field and remedy those sorts of things. And the consequences are severe enough that I do believe there's less of doping to those kinds of levels that we saw in baseball and sports like that.
Yeah. Well, I've been in lit support for a lot of my career, and a lot of our business is driven by second requests and antitrust type stuff. So when the administrations change, people in my industry, we pay attention because it could affect the amount of work that we do. How about your industry? When you're in the sports realm and you go from Democrat or Republican or vice versa, does it ever make a difference with sports? I would think it probably means a little bit less. those changes would mean less in your area.
Yeah, there are fewer issues that are fundamental like that. There are specific pockets, for example, the Live PGA Tour ongoing questions that the Justice Department's been looking at. There is a thought that Donald Trump's administration, given that Donald Trump was a giant supporter of the Live Tour and they put a bunch of tournaments at his golf courses and so on, that there might be a change in position of the government toward that relationship when the new administration comes in. But in general, the fundamental issues about antitrust law and so on aren't as affected by the administration. And there aren't those kinds of issues. The leagues have adopted to what the state of the law is. And there's been very little like antitrust enforcement in the sports world by the government. Almost all antitrust enforcement in recent years in sports has been private parties bringing private cases.
Well, Mark, I know we mentioned earlier that you played soccer at UVA. How'd you get started in sports?
I always loved sports, but I always assumed that as soon as I was done with school, my connection to sports would be over, other than watching it on television or going to a game. When I came to Williams and Connolly, the founder of the firm, Edward Bennett Williams, was the lead trial lawyer in the country, and he also happened to own the Baltimore Orioles and 15% of the Redskins. So when I came for the summer, I sort of realized that we had sports clients, and given that I wanted to develop a firm antitrust practice that was more formalized rather than just random cases that came in, I needed to know something about sports antitrust for when the boss came by and said, we have a sports client. And so I read every case I could find about sports and antitrust, so I'd be ready. And in 1985, Ed Williams was asked to sort of keep an eye on the USFL lawsuit, the giant lawsuit by the first spring league against the National Football League. And another partner's client was very involved in professional tennis. And I ended up writing a complaint and spending 4 years litigating an antitrust case involving professional tennis and the whole history of tennis. And so from that, I met lots of people in the sports industry. And in those days, people who wanted to be sports lawyers either became sports agents or they really didn't want to be lawyers. They just wanted to do, they thought maybe if their practice had something to do with sports, it would be more fun and they'd enjoy it more. And so lots of people I met saw me as a rarity, which was a young lawyer who had some knowledge and interest in sports, who wasn't interested in being a GM or being an agent. I liked disputes about the business of the sport. And because I was a young associate, I didn't cost very much. And so lots of people started to send me sports-related matters.
Seemed like it would be hard to consciously be the kind of sports attorney you are. It seems like it just kind of happened. You fell into a great place and it worked out. It seems like if you had tried to make a career of that, it would have been a much more complicated road for you.
Yes. Lots of the matters I did, I couldn't have brought in unless I had a law firm around me of senior people who were viewed as the best at what they did. It was sort of letting the firm know I had knowledge about this subject. And then we had 100 lawyers, all with contacts in various ways, who then would get contacted about something related to sports, and then I would get involved. There isn't that much of this. What I have is a dispute-related practice, and there are a few firms that have ongoing relationships with the major entities. The main sports litigation matters involve the big sports leagues, the big players associations. And those organizations, in large part, have the same law firms that they had in the 1980s when I started doing this. And they've held on to those clients all those years. So my practice has been people around the edges, new sports players associations, a new league, various athletes with dispute issues in various areas, whether it's doping, labor law, antitrust law, whatever field. And often I get cases over the years have been sent to me by the lawyers who represent the leagues or the players associations. When something comes to them, they don't think they should be doing it because In the same way that people represent plaintiffs or defendants in other practice areas, in the sports area, there are people who represent leagues and people who represent players' associations generally, and very few who do both. I've represented people in all different sides of those issues. And from some work with some Olympic athletes, I then got involved in the doping world and spent 5 years representing the U.S. Olympic Committee as their outside counsel. And so that's, as a result, I've had matters involving 35 different sports and that kind of reach. A lot of them were very, very small matters, but that's not my full-time practice. That's probably been half to a third to a half of my practice over the years has been sports related. The rest has been general antitrust work and other work related to businesses and corporations and individuals involved in business.
And do you like that work any more or less than the sports work?
The other work is often, if they're big enough that they're going to pay our legal fees, and they're more complicated, they're more challenging, and they involve also disputes where the parties are more likely to want to go all the way to a trial. What happens in sports is the disputes are often between people who have to continue to do business with each other. If it's between a player and a league, a players association and a league, at the end of the day, they have to make a deal and continue to function together. The cases that go to trial or that you're reading about now are big cases where all the former athletes are suing the NCAA or things like that. Those athletes will have no ongoing relationship with the NCAA. It's just about getting, money for them and maybe for athletes in the future. And our firm has not generally been a big to take class action contingent fee cases against entities. And so that's not been our practice area. So I've represented coaches in disputes with teams and GMs and teams seeking to relocate in a battle with their leagues, just lots of different kinds of legal issues. But they tend to have an end date. And they often, in the past, didn't have enough money at stake that people really wanted to spend what it would take to get a matter all the way to trial.
That's interesting. Well, Mark, when I was growing up, Edward Bennett Williams was this huge figure that turned the Redskins into a winner after many years of being an also-ran. And talking to the other day, it turns out he's basically only a 25% owner. But
15.
What's that?
15%.
15% owner, but he was the face of the Redskins in the 70s, I remember. And then I guess in 85, Jack Kent Cooke, who obviously was another larger than life figure in the DC area, took over. Who was Edward Bennett Williams, and why did he start the firm Williams and Connolly?
Well, Ed Williams was a young lawyer out of Georgetown who wanted to be a trial lawyer, who used to, while he was in law school, go over to the courthouse and watch cases. He was a bigger than life guy. He was one of the few people I've ever met who had a huge reputation and more than lived up to it when you met him. He knew how to try cases. And he started with a small firm and grew it based on top talent. People who could try cases and people who'd, been very successful in their law school, whatever career, but it was a combination. He'd hear about a lawyer who was a military prosecutor and he thought had done a great job, and he'd call him up and say, "You want to come work for my firm?" So it was a firm of trial lawyers at the top levels of the firm. And he grew it to a 75 lawyer firm when I started. And now we're in the 300s. But it didn't grow like those New York firms, only had one office. And Ed was at the forefront in seeing that everybody deserved representation. The big New York law firms that represented corporations wouldn't handle a criminal case. They had the view, and their clients had the view, they didn't want their lawyers representing criminals because people might think that they were criminals if they were represented by the law firm and so on. And Ed represented everyone from organized crime figures to heads of unions to major corporations to major political figures. So, he represented Joe McCarthy when there were the hearings, not when McCarthy was going after people, but when tide turned and the Senate was going after Joe McCarthy, Ed Williams was his lawyer. He really pioneered that view that everybody deserved the best, and it didn't matter, what walk of life they were. And that's what the firm grew out of. And then when he got involved in sports, he was the smartest guy in the room at owners' meetings, and clearly the only lawyer. And a lot of those people were not the successful businessmen that are today. Weren't guys who made millions or billions and then bought a team. They were guys whose families bought a team in 1920 or 1930 for $30,000.
Lamar Hunt, the
The
Rooneys, or what? Yeah,
the Wellington Maras, the
yeah.
Dan Rooneys, the Billy Bidwells, the Billy Sullivans. These guys did not have some massive other business on the side. This was their business. And Ed was just much more knowledgeable about the world of business and the world of law. So all those people turned to him for those kinds of matters. And for a bunch of years, when I first started the firm, from 1982, when I was there for the summer, 1983, when I started, until Ed died in 1988, a big part of what we did was make yourself look good enough that there'd be a meeting with Ed and you and the client, and how quickly could you make the client comfortable that Ed didn't have to be in every meeting and do everything, because there's no way he could handle the massive number of matters that came to him. I always talked about positioning yourself to take the hand off from Ed. And then when the client got unhappy that it had been 6 months and they hadn't seen Ed Williams and he was supposedly their lawyer, you let him know that you're going to be meeting with the client in the conference room, and could he stop by and tell a few stories and talk about the Redskins and convince the client, yep, Ed Williams is still my lawyer. And then he could go back to doing all of his other cases and you could handle the work. So, but there was just a lot of lawyers who clerked for the Supreme Court, and a lot of lawyers who'd tried a ton of cases. And the guys, they did everything in the old days, from people getting hurt on the trolley that ran in Georgetown and things like that. So they knew how to go into a courtroom, and that was not common among big law firms, that anybody had tried a lot of cases. They had bigger cases, they settled them all. They were corporate disputes. But Ed Williams and his guys got in court all the time.
It seems interesting that he get a taste of sports ownership, the press, and could still have the same enthusiasm and passion for practicing law. That's I know there are probably some owners that have businesses, but when you run a law firm and you practice law, it's pretty all encompassing. You can't really just turn that off. As you were saying, he was busy. Did he have the same passion for practicing law as we saw when he, as an owner of?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he was trying cases right up to the end, and these were big cases. Again, there are people who like the practice of law because of what you do. There are people who like the practice of law because it's a way to help people. Somebody comes into your office who's got a problem, and it's overwhelming to them because it involves the legal system that they don't understand. And you're able to look at the fact situation, figure out how bad it is, how bad it isn't, educate them on where they sit, and then guide them through it. And the biggest thing you're doing often is taking away the stress. You can say, look, sometimes in the first meeting, here's the worst thing that's going to happen. It's a civil case. You're not going to jail. So it's not a criminal case. The most they could get in an incredible world would be X dollars. You have a lot more than that. It won't ruin your life. It's going to take 3 years, whatever it's going to take, depending on the court you're in and the nature of the dispute. We'll get through it. And, here's the worst case and the best case. And, here's the probability. And people like doing that. I mean, because you can really help people more than people understand.
Yeah. Well, let's for a little bit, let's go back to the UVA days. And I when I asked you how you got into sports, I was actually curious how you got into soccer and how you got into sports as a player, even though it was interesting about how you got into the practice of law as well. But how did you start playing sports? And I know, soccer was one of those sports in your day. It had its pockets of interest around the country, like St. Louis and New Jersey, parts of Long Island, the DC area. But, soccer wasn't played everywhere like it is today. So anyway, how'd you get into sports as a player and also soccer?
Well, as a kid, my dad loved sports. He worked hard. and he made time for when he had school issues, but he also figured out quickly he was excited about sports. I became excited about sports as a young kid. He was a punter. He actually played all five sports in high school and was a very good athlete from Michigan. So, but I was going to go try out for the football team in ninth grade. And somebody came around the last day of eighth grade and said, anybody interested in the soccer team? Well, I'd never seen anyone play soccer in my life. And I sort of took stock and wasn't very big and had skipped sixth grade. So I was a little younger as well. And I said, I'm probably not going to play a lot on the football team. I mean, I played a lot of touch football around the neighborhood, but I didn't have the size or whatever. So I tried this soccer thing. And only 16 guys tried out for our freshman soccer team. So there were no cuts. I played goalkeeper a couple of years because I could catch, and my dad had taught me how to punt when I was 4, so I could punt the ball a long way. And then I figured out that if I was going to play on the varsity, we had a star goalkeeper who was my year. I had to learn how to play the field, spent the summer working hard at it, and played, high school soccer for 2 years. And then amazingly, got recruited to play soccer at Virginia. But people don't remember, if you wanted to go to a college in those days, you had to write and ask for an application. They mailed it to you, right? Because you couldn't go to the library. They don't have like hundreds of schools' applications. And they would send you a postcard to send back that said what activities you have in school. And if you put a sport, they would send it to the coach. That's how he learned like who might be thinking about coming to his school. There were no showcases. And the soccer coach called me and claimed that he knew from people in my, conference how good I was. I think he made it all up, and paid for me to take the train down there. And I was so excited because that was my goal in life, to be a student athlete. That really was sort of the dream. But I just loved the whole feel of it. And team sports were more for me. I played a lot of tennis, so I was also recruited for tennis back in those days, but I liked the team sport aspect. I'd given up baseball because I could make the varsity tennis team. And I thought it was important to get a varsity letter in high school. I have no idea why I thought that was important. But so I gave up baseball, and soccer was just the ultimate team sport. I mean, we didn't have, my son would tell you rowing is the ultimate team sport, but because you're all sitting in the boat and have to do things together. But it was just a great game. And but back then, it was unthinkable that I first played soccer in ninth grade, and I could play varsity soccer at a Division I school, and play and travel as a freshman. You couldn't even be allowed to try out at a Division I top school if you started playing in ninth grade. And there was no travel soccer. Every season you played a different sport. So my total experience in soccer was from late August until November, 4 seasons. That was it.
That wasn't Bruce Arena you played for, was it? That was before Bruce Arena?
I had ankle surgery after second year. Bruce Arena came to UVA my senior year at UVA, my 4th year. But I was not playing by then. But Bruce was his first year. It was a guy named Larry Gross was our coach. But he was an assistant lacrosse coach. And he was really hired to be the assistant lacrosse coach and required to coach soccer in those days. It wasn't. We had my high school soccer team was in the top 10 in the state of New Jersey. We'd have 1,000 people at a game. UVA soccer games, we'd have 50 people in Scott Stadium. I just remember there'd be somebody in the stands yelling at the ref, and the ref would turn and look like 20 rows up in the section because he's all by himself and point to the guy and tell him to shut up. I mean, that was the kind of, there were, no one knew that there was a game going on. You didn't have, calendars posted. So other than a few family members and close friends, nobody came to watch soccer games at Virginia.
No, we all love soccer on that bluish green AstroTurf. So you were at UVA at a very interesting time because your freshman year, UVA won the ACC tournament, I believe, with Wally Walker. That was a huge moment for me. I was a 10-year-older, but UVA, that was the first time we won it in the history of our school. It was the first really big seminal, probably sports.
And when did we win it again? When did we win it the second time?
I don't know.
2014.
Is that right? Wow. I had no idea it took so long. Um,
38 years
so we
until we
had
won
some
the ACC
we
tournament
had some
again.
great teams with Ralph Sampson. I think got to the final 2 or 3 times, never won it. Um, but you were also there during the Dick Beswick football years. Yeah, I guess you missed Sonny Randall, thankfully, but you got just Dick Beswick football team. Good man, but the football team was struggling. You got there, I believe, the pre George Welsh era when he turned it around. What are your memories of Wahoo sports when you were there? It was definitely at a time before we were a big time sports school.
So Sonny Randall was my freshman year,
Oh,
but I was playing soccer. Then I hurt my ankle, got my cleats caught in the turf. And so I decided I would go out as a punter. So actually, I was in the spring of my first year, I was going to be a backup punter on the UVA football team under Dick Beswick. And it was a very funny sort of thing because so you have a new coach, learned a lot about football. You have a new coach, and the team was terrible. My 4 years, UVA won 6 games total in 4 years. And I've looked at the history. There was 1 year, one set of years, if you picked in the entire history of UVA football, where they won 5 games in 4 years. But other than that, it was the worst 4 years of Virginia football's record. And when Beswick shows up, there are all these players who've been starters on a team that was not any good. And the players are worried if, the coach knows who they are and are they going to still have their jobs and all that. So when you have spring practice, he made it clear that the guys who are coming back, because there were walk-ons and so on, who all of a sudden decided they wanted to come out in the spring, that those guys got preferential treatment, that he understood who they were and so on. So I'm here to be a punter, and he has me doing defensive drills and, being the running back for tackling drills. And I weigh about 135 pounds, and I'm about 5'7" then, still growing. And I'm getting clobbered. And Russ Henderson was our star punter. He was like the only guy on the team who was like best in the ACC.
You got a lot of practice.
Well, and in the 12 games or 11 games, whatever the fall season was, more than half of them, Russ Henderson, our punter, was the player of the game that they picked.
That's bad.
How many times does the school have their punter as the player of the game ever? Much less more than half the time. But he was trying out for quarterback because he was like 6'2", and Beswick pulled me aside after a week or two and said, "Look, I know you're doing all the punting, but this is great, and he's going to be our starting punter. But right now he's playing quarterback, and you've just got to do these other drills while." So we're doing punt blocking drills where it's okay to hit the punter in order to get practice on what it's like to block a punt. So I am getting sort of pounded back there, and he basically said, "Look, go back, work on your ankle. Here's a football. Come on down and punt some, but you don't have to come to practice every day. And if Russ gets hurt, I'll call you and you can come back and whatever." But UVA sports was not, the football games were a big party. There was lots of drinking. Everybody left at halftime, that sort of thing. And but the basketball team was the one thing that put people in the seats. But remember, the ACC only had 9 teams back then. University Hall was the arena. It only held 6,200 people. Maybe 9,000 for basketball, but 6,200 for a concert.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And but it wasn't ever sold out. And yeah, the Wally Walker was our one amazing thing. And that was the only time we went to the NCAA tournament, because in those days it was like 32 teams. And the only way we would get to go is if we won the tournament. And Ralph showed up the fall after I graduated. So I never was there for the years of Ralph.
Yeah, it's too bad. Well, you were, and by the way, Todd Kirtley was the quarterback for Dick Beswick. He was the quarterback at my high school, and he at UVA, and I've interviewed him before. Just a great guy. So you missed the Ralph Sampson years, but you were at Harvard Law School in the paper chase years, I believe. That must have been an exciting time to be at Harvard Law.
Harvard Law was like, everybody was afraid of Harvard Law. Paper Chase had come out, the movie, a bunch of years before that, I think. People don't remember, but Love Story, the main character, Ryan O'Neal, goes to law school at Harvard Law School.
Great movie.
The book 1L had come out by Scott Turow, that made it sound super horrendously terrible. I mean, I'll meet people who went to like UPenn Law School at the same time as I did. And they'll ask me, like, what was it like to be at Harvard? And I was like, probably the same as it was to be at Penn. I mean, I don't think it was like, no, because I read those books, and it was the whole point of those was to give you this message about how fierce and hard it was. It was intense. Harvard was not a friendly place for students. It was sort of the tradition, what we went through, you have to go through. Exams after Christmas, so they would ruin your Christmas vacation, things like that. But before I went, I realized that I got my best grades when I was playing soccer because it structured my day, got me out running around. I was tired. I didn't mind sitting and reading. So I called the men's soccer coach before I got there and said, "Do you need an assistant?" And talk about those days, he said, "No, I coach by myself." He didn't have a single assistant. Like him and the bag of balls and walk out to the field. That was the Harvard soccer team. And he said, "Why don't you call the women's coach?" And I was like, "The women's what coach?" He said, "Women's soccer coach." I had never seen a girl kick a soccer ball. It turns out there was a club team at UVA, but I didn't even know that. And so I called Bob Scalise, who was the head men's lacrosse coach and the head women's soccer coach, and said, "You need an assistant." And he had a couple already, but none of them had played much soccer, if any. And so I became, all 3 years, I was an assistant women's soccer coach for the varsity and JV for 2 years was the best team in the country, the Harvard women's soccer team. And then Bob Scalise left and went back to business school and then became the athletic director for 30 years at Harvard. So I learned a lot about college sports and athletics from being part of, a college. And then in the spring, there was no soccer. So I became an assistant coach for the Harvard women's tennis team as well.
That's fun. And still able to get a job at Williams and Connolly after all that fun you're having. Well, Mark, this has been great. I'm so glad we got a chance to do this. I did want to ask you. We did talk about some hot button issues that I brought up. But when you think about your practice as an antitrust lawyer and the sports lawyer, what are some of the hot button issues do you see in the future that no one may be talking about right now? What are some of the things we may see happening over the next several years in sports that maybe we didn't touch on earlier today?
Well, the biggest issue is going to be college sports because the transformation is going to be difficult and there's all sorts of complications. Right. So the issues are labor law. Can athletes unionize or not? And how does that play out when you're at a state university and state business, state government owned businesses are exempt from certain provisions of labor laws? And this idea that somehow the players will form a union and that will solve these things. That's not going to work. Having represented the U.S. men's national soccer players for now 28 years, the weapon that athletes have is a strike. It's going to be hard to have convince, and we've seen how hard it is to execute a strike. With my soccer players, they have other jobs. They play for pro teams as well as playing for the U.S. national team. We could go on strike. We could just cancel national team games and the guys wouldn't be out of work. They'd be playing for Premier League teams and MLS teams and all that sort of stuff. We've made it clear we were going to go on strike about 5 or 6 times in the course of 28 years. It always got resolved. We've never missed a game because they understood we would do it and that they would have to talk to us eventually. So they'd come to the table and they make a deal. How are you going to talk to 4 years of college kids who are on the football team and say, "Hi, let's go on strike"? To get what? To get more money for who? For the 85th guy on the roster or the star quarterback? And they only have 4 years. Like, what are they going to? They're not going to make it up. They don't have a 10-year career they're worried about. So, and trying to convince a kid who's 18 who tells his parents, "Hi, I'm going to go out on strike." He'll end up in the transfer portal. He'll go to some other school instead of striking. I mean, it's just chaos. So there's just too many different legal principles that are at stake there. And because we've gone straight from zero to total free agency with the transfer portal, I mean, it's totally distorted the game. I mean, imagine if the NBA coach had to make sure he kept the guy on the bench happy because if he didn't give him enough playing time, he was just going to unilaterally decide to leave. Can you make a 4-year deal with a player that takes away his right to transfer or not? And if the money's coming from a collective, how does Title IX come into play? Does the collective have to spend the same amount of money on women players as men players? I mean, and what about the star swimmer? Do you have to pay her? And how does that affect her Olympic eligibility? I mean, there's all sorts of chaos that goes on and it's going to be hard to fix it. And in part because, I talked to a guy who was the runner-up to be the head of the NCAA. We do a lot of employment work for people in big positions. He was looking to get this job. He came to us for employment advice. And I basically explained to him all the problems he was going to face if he was head of the NCAA. And he said, okay, so what's the answer? It's like, I have no idea. Unless you have total control of the legislature and you can change the labor laws, the antitrust laws, the tax laws, right? If you're now an employee, does your scholarship, is that income you have to pay taxes on? I mean, how do all those things work that have to be figured out? And then the whole Olympic world is going crazy right now over the fact that for many, many Olympic sports, college is the pipeline. So universities are paying for swimming programs and track and field programs and all those things that generate our Olympic gold medals, that if they have to cut sports because they can't afford non-revenue sports or sports that are losing money, where are those athletes going to come from? So once that, do we have to have some bad Olympics where we lose a few times? You have bad years before a solution is found? Or is someone going to come along and, start at the beginning and figure it all out from the start? And it's hard. I mean, if you remember in 1993, when they first brought the salary cap to the NFL, there'd been antitrust litigation and chaos in football after the 87 strike was unsuccessful with the replacement players and all that. They have litigation through 92. And in 93, they come up with a new collective bargaining agreement that includes a salary cap and more free agency. And all of a sudden, left tackle salaries skyrocket because no one realized. Everyone understands how important those people were, but because they were drafted and they had nowhere to go, they paid them almost nothing. And they became the second highest paid players on the team behind the quarterback. Wow. And Moneyball talks about that in the book by Michael Lewis and so on as to why that's the case. But once free market comes into play, lots of things happen you don't anticipate. You just don't know where it's coming from. And that's part of where we are in college sports. And there was a union and a league who could work out those problems, sit down and solve them. There was all sorts of money under the table, under the old cap, or deals that paid more than people thought. But the union and the league would sit down and they would reach an agreement and bound everybody. There's nobody in place to do that right now in college sports, and there's no likelihood of that in the future. And we're not just talking about Division I, we're talking Division II, Division III. So that's where the biggest uncertainty is in sports. The other thing you should know is with the big sports leagues, they've faced labor litigation, antitrust litigation for 40 years. And they get to write the rules because like when owners are suing the league over certain issues, all the owners can come together and make new rules that make it really hard for that to happen. And they know exactly what the cases are going to be. And when they lose a case, they can rewrite the rules so they'll win the next case. And they're sophisticated and they've looked at every issue many, many times. And so there are fewer and fewer issues that haven't been litigated and solved in collective bargaining agreements or in the league rules. It's these other areas in the Olympic sports, in the college sports. And then there is this influx of new sports, and that's going to continue to happen, whether it's the women's sports, whether it's pickleball, whether it's people out there creating other new sports. That's going to be the new frontier. And with this democratizing of the media, because everybody can find a streaming channel if there's people willing to watch, and people not buying cable anymore, the question is, what impact is that going to have? And will these as you've said, you can watch Premier League soccer, you can watch Serie A games. So the worldwide competition is changing things a lot.
Or maybe it'll be esports, huh? So, look, Mark.
That's a good example. Esports. Everybody bought teams. There was a town willing to do a bond issue recently to build a stadium for esports. The question is, will people be playing esports in 10 years or 20? Who even knows? I haven't heard much about esports recently.
I haven't either.
And it was thought that was going to be the next college sport. There's like Wayne State or somebody had a esports team with scholarships. Haven't heard anything about that, but there's now, pickleball and cornhole competitions among colleges are growing like crazy. So it's just hard to know where, what people are going to want to watch in the future.
Yeah. Well, look, Mark, I really enjoyed the dialogue. This has been great. I'm so thankful for Peter for making the connection. But look, I hope you continue to have a wonderful holiday season. I know you're at the lake, hopefully with lots of family and it looks like pets as well. So, well, look, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, and let's keep in touch.
Anything I can do, always happy to chat.
Yeah, it's great, Mark. Let's get together when you get back in town.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You're welcome, Mike. Thanks. Yep. Bye-bye.